out and go and have fun. No, this is not it. This is not it. If we look at medical other herbs like yarrow, as I've said last week, which is a completely innocuous plant. However, if it is ingested by a pregnant woman, it can have disastrous consequences. So just because it's natural doesn't mean that it's completely safe. However, just because it's medical doesn't mean it's completely safe either, because cough syrups, medications with codeine, opioids, all of these things are inherently addictive and extremely, extremely dangerous for us on the long term. So we must always maintain common sense about these things, and today's show, we want to actually break it down completely. We want to talk about where the stigma came from about this plant. We want to talk about how it originated, where it originated. We want to talk about the health benefits. We want to talk about the addictive properties of it or not, and how to overcome those or not. And for that, we needed an expert who has been working with this plant for many, many years. Now, in South Africa, I think you will agree with me that there is nobody who kind of understands this plant more than the two people who have lobbied for the destigmatization of this plant and the decriminalization, more importantly, of this plant. And that is two people that were known as the Dagga couple. Now, Julian Stobbs and Myrtle Clark have been at the forefront of the fight to free the plant so that proper research can be done, so that people know what they're getting, so that regulations can be put in place. And it's not about just, freeing the plant to just be free for all. And so today we are speaking to the one half, the surviving half, Myrtle Clark, who is going to talk to us about the legislation around it, the history around it, the medical properties around it. So let's find out more. Myrtle is on the line with us. If you'd like to see us on Facebook or on YouTube, please join us, Radio Al Ansar. If you are joining us on radio, then you're on 90.4 FM, 105.6 FM in Pietermaritzburg. And we're speaking to Myrtle Clark. Good morning, Myrtle. How are you?
Good morning, Rabia. I'm great, thanks, and very pleased to be here with you today.
I'm so grateful to have you on the show. It's always very difficult to find, the right person that's going to give us a balanced view, but is going to give us the fact and the truth, and has actually walked with this plant, rather than somebody who kind of reads and gets his knowledge off the street. And it's so important, I think, for any youngsters that may be listening in, and any parents, to really get the truth about this plant. So I mentioned that there are non-psychoactive components in cannabis besides CBD. I've mentioned some of the THC types, some being very psychoactive, but then some being non-psychoactive. But let's start at the beginning. I think about my years when I first started as a social worker, and my first community project was a campaign against Dagga. And we call it Dagga in South Africa. We call it Kef. We call it Mary Jane. We call it cannabis. We call it Zol. Yes, a very South African name. But where did the plant kind of become such an international banned plant? Take us through the history.
Well, thank you for that question. It's so terribly important that we understand the history of the prohibition of cannabis, because we've always said that the harms of prohibition far outweigh the perceived harms of the plant. When people are looking at the harms of the actual plant, they most probably don't have experience of the harms of prohibition. And, once you have smelled the inside of a South African police holding cell, you'll never get that smell out of your nose, So it's important to remember the history, and it's very important for us here in South Africa to note that we were among the 3 countries who initiated the very first prohibition against cannabis. And that was us and Egypt and Brazil. And it started here in South Africa in 1878.
Wow.
As we know from our history here in South Africa, that many Indian folk were brought over from India as indentured laborers, which is actually just another word for a slave. And people were
Yes.
brought over from India to work in the sugarcane fields, and mainly in what was then the Natal province. They brought with them their sacraments, their bang, seeds of the cannabis plant, because it was so ingrained for millennia in their lives. So obviously when they came over, they were promised this amazing life. They were brought over here and they were put to work really, really hard manual labor in the fields. And they used their sacrament, their bang, not only as an aid for their spirituality, but also as something to help them get through this very hard physical work. Because what happens with cannabis is that it integrates you into your environment. And if you are doing long, hard, boring work in the hot sun, you need to be able to work slowly and steadily so that you can get through your 8 or 10 hours of your day. And the bang really helped these people to do this. The British soldiers who were governing the Natal colony at that time really didn't like this very much at all, because they felt that it made the laborers slow. It felt that they were lazy, but they didn't understand that it's much better to work slowly and consistently through the day than to try and start off and rush through your day. You'll just physically, it's not possible. So on the word of one British doctor, our then head of state, Jan Smuts, wrote to the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, and suggested, because they were busy outlawing opium because of the opium wars in China, which is another whole big long colonial story, and said, well, what about this stuff? What about this dacha? What about this kief, this hash? And they were joined by Egypt and Brazil, which was another country that was colonized by Portugal. And if you look at the history of the prohibition of cannabis, we have these parallels in all of the colonies around the world, with mainly the British, but also to a certain extent the Dutch and the Portuguese, really working against our local traditions. And so in 1878, there was the first racist law in South Africa of one population group lording it over another population group and prohibit them from using their sacrament. So that went on to develop in the League of Nations, and in 1925, cannabis was outlawed internationally. So next year we will be celebrating how far we've come with the prohibition of plants, and we will also be remembering this 100-year history that we've had, which is something that is steeped in racism and colonialism. And in South Africa, lots of people don't remember that, because one must also realize that this is the most successful propaganda campaign ever. When the Americans jumped onto the bandwagon in 1950s, we know that the Americans are the masters of marketing. And we had people like Harry Anslinger and people, and then the war on weed, really, the devil's lettuce. Keep your children away, It's going to turn your daughters into loose women. And so it went, and it's so ingrained. And last point on the history is that in 1976, when the apartheid government decided to clamp down on the dacha laws, within the first 18 months of them introducing even more stringent laws, we had 76,000 black males arrested on dacha charges. It was a weapon that was used by the apartheid state.
Wow. Okay. So from a legislation perspective and international, I did not know this, and I'm sure the listener at home will be surprised to know the role that South Africa's played in the kind of banning of this plant. It's always interesting for me as well, Myrtle, how there is a plant and, it has its pros, it has its cons. We're going to talk about those, but it is a plant. It's God-given. Allah's created it, right? And then we have allopathic remedies with cough syrups that contain codeine that kids are taking, with codeine over the counter as painkillers, with opioids easy to obtain. And it's almost like if it's pharmaceutical, then it's okay. And if it's plant, then it's not. And one of the reasons why I do the Nature's Apothecary on Green Thumbs Up is because we need to educate people on what the plants actually are, their dangers and their benefits. So talking a little bit about those dangers and benefits, I'm not sure if you were online, but you may have heard our Islamic scholar speaking. But let's talk about then from a health perspective. Because there's been so much research. I was looking online and there is research upon research and a growing body of research in terms of cannabis with, where it can be used, where it should be used with caution, how it should be used, how it should be even grown. Because over time, it feels like because it went underground, because, cannabis use went underground, it led to the growth and the, shall we say, the development of cannabis strains that are, some of them extremely potent, and some of them they're not. So it's extremely difficult to regulate. I mean, there's no pure sativa, there's no pure indica, there's all of these hybrids. So if we talk about some of the health benefits, where have we seen the greatest health benefit from cannabis?
Well, I think that the greatest health benefit among people who use cannabis is general well-being. Because as human beings, we have something in our bodies called the endocannabinoid system, which is triggered by cannabis. Now, we have always, ever since there's been the existence of human beings on the planet, we have always had this endocannabinoid system. And we have always, in South Africa, we've had a relationship with the plant for over 700 years, since it was brought to Africa by Arab traders, and it was distributed down the waterways, down the rivers and across the continent, and it spread north and south. And human beings react to cannabis in a certain way. Not everybody reacts to it in the same way. So that's why it's a very complicated medicine. But the basics of it is that we have an endocannabinoid system. And the receptors in this system are triggered by cannabis. Now, the health benefits are enormous. You could be from here until next week listing all of the health benefits, from the eating of the seeds, which has omega-1 to 6 oils in it. The nutritional benefits have been known for millennia. And that doesn't involve any smoking, And then, of course, all of the industrial applications of it, and that benefits our environment. So human beings cannot be separated from our environment. Cannabis is part of our environment as a plant. It has also been in our pharmacopoeia for thousands and thousands of years. And it's very sad that doctors in South Africa right now are really not trained. They've never learned about the endocannabinoid system because of 100 years of prohibition. But our traditional healers, they certainly know about cannabis. We have a great wealth of traditional knowledge here in South Africa and in the rest of Africa with the traditional use of cannabis as a health benefit. So one has to look that the major health benefit of cannabis is it integrating you into your environment, it making you aware of plant-based medicines, it being a safer alternative to a lot of the pharmaceutical medicines, and that's just the really broad picture. But if we look back to the early research, we can say that since the 1960s, we've known that it is very good for epilepsy, and we've known it's been very good for glaucoma. And since the advent of chemotherapy, we have known that it's very good for the side effects of chemotherapy. So those are three things that affect our people in South Africa really, really badly. And cannabis can help with all those three, just as examples.
You know, it's interesting that you bring up epilepsy, because in my research, I went back to, who used cannabis originally. And it was interesting for me that it was Islamic scholars, Islamic doctors that prescribed cannabis particularly for epilepsy. And kind of, coming full circle today. So that was an interesting one. So looking at cannabis, looking at the health benefits, I know with Crohn's disease, with glaucoma, of course, cancer. Myself, my father was a cancer sufferer, and he passed on 3 years ago now, and pancreatic cancer that suddenly emerged. And his lifespan that could have been 4 to 5 months in a lot of pain became a year, and his pain was managed, kind of using that to manage pain rather than morphine, which brings me to another topic. The cannabis is often seen as a gateway to other drugs. Can we have your comment on that?
Well, I would say that cannabis is the exit from other drugs. It turned that whole thing over on its head. That was one of the most successful of the propaganda campaigns disseminated by the Americans starting in the 1950s and 1960s. It was a very plausible argument. But, in South Africa, we estimate that we have around about 15 million cannabis users. So if it was the gateway drug, I would like to know why there aren't 15 million heroin addicts. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up when you are as immersed as I am in the cannabis culture. You just know that it just is not a gateway drug. It's an exit drug because we have a terrible methamphetamine problem in our country. And the two things that cannabis really helps with is appetite and sleep. And if you've been up for 3 days on all sorts of ugly drugs, you now are really strung out. Your body is going to give up, and you need to eat and you need to sleep. And what do a lot of people use who also use other substances? They use cannabis as the exit. And this is also not often known amongst the general public. So there's another medicinal benefit. I've known lots of people who have substance use disorders and have used cannabis to help them with that particular problem that they have that is making their life unmanageable. And cannabis can make people's lives manageable again.
Okay, so it restores the appetite, helps him to sleep, probably reduces the anxiety related to the withdrawals, because withdrawals from hardcore drugs are extremely strong on the body because it's a chemical dependency, right? Now, when it comes to cannabis, and we talk broadly about cannabis because cannabis does actually include hemp, which is completely non-psychoactive, and you could get it at the Pick and Pay, the hemp seeds, and feed them to your birds and even put them in your porridge for the medical benefits of it. But so we're talking about cannabis from ruderalis to sativa to indica to all the hybrids in between. When we talk about cannabis addiction, are we also talking about a chemical addiction, or is this more kind of people become addicted to it psychologically, and what is the difference there?
Okay, so we never say that cannabis is harmless, because there's nothing that in the world that is harmless. So cannabis is not harmless, but the word addiction is very problematic in drug policy circles, because it is so very stigmatizing. And people use all sorts of things to cope with this very challenging world that we live in. And we have people who play too many video games, people who drive too fast. We have people who work too hard. There's various things in people's lives that makes their lives unmanageable. And various obsessions that people have. And that can happen with cannabis too. People can use too much cannabis and lose focus in their lives. But what we always say is that you cannot possibly blame the drug. You cannot blame the cocaine or blame the heroin or blame the cannabis, because there's always an underlying factor. If people become obsessive about one area on their life, there's a reason why they are wanting to escape there. And you would know, as a social worker, one has to look at the underlying causes. So my teenage son is sitting in his room smoking weed and playing video games all the time. He doesn't want, he just eats fast food and he doesn't want to communicate. Well, number one, he's a teenager. Number two, you should have been having the conversation about cannabis with him, because we do not recommend that people under the age of 18 use cannabis. And the reason why they use it is because they want to be a rebel or they want to escape. And you should be asking your son, are you perhaps being bullied at school? What's wrong? Are you battling with your studies? There's usually a reason, underlying reason. So no, one doesn't like to use the word addictive. We rather use the word substance use disorder or dependence on. But no, cannabis is not chemically addictive. And if you are a heavy cannabis user like myself, and I need to travel and I maybe don't have access to my cannabis, the only effect that I feel is that I lose my appetite and I might have slight problems sleeping. And I might need to have a glass of wine because it's legal where I'm traveling, instead of having my usual cannabis in the evening. So now, which is the most harmful? One needs to think about the scale of harms. And there's been a very important study done on the scale of harms. And we all know that alcohol is the most dangerous drug.
Yeah. So we were hoping to get Professor Nutt on the show, and we're still waiting to hear that perhaps he could join us in upcoming weeks. Professor Nutt is the top international researcher, medical researcher on cannabis, and he speaks about how of all the drugs, whether we're talking about cocaine, we're talking about methamphetamines, we're talking about cannabis, of all of the drugs and medical plants, I want to add that alcohol is actually the most damaging. But just as a side note, there's a brilliant book that he's written. He's written several. So if you, the listener, are at home and you want to know more about that research that is being conducted, then look into the work by Professor Nutt, N-U-T-T. So if it's not a chemical, shall we say, so you were talking about substance abuse dependency or substance abuse, substance dependency. And it's being used as a exit drug for other drugs. We're looking at the medicinal properties of it. And you mentioned something so important. And yes, as a social worker, we were taught that there is a symptom, and the symptom could be, for instance, the use of marijuana. However, the symptom is not necessarily the real issue. And in order to resolve the symptom, we've got to resolve the real issue, which is what you're talking about, right? The social constructs, the family relationships, the various dynamics that lead to abuse of a plant that was created and given to us for its positive benefits, of which there are many. You mentioned some, I've mentioned some, between glaucoma, pain management, cancer, asthmatics, people during COVID. I know of myself of people during COVID that really struggled to get the bronchioles open. And because of all the fluid that got built up. And what they were doing is they were either steaming with or smoking the cannabis, various forms, whether it was CBD, whether it was THC, because they were trying to find something. And yes, it is something that I have to say, because it happened, it is the truth, that opened up those bronchioles and allowed people to breathe deeper and to heal internally from, the ravages of this virus. I also know of people who have come off of asthma medications and use cannabis, obviously under the guidance of medical professionals. So there is so much, I think, from a health perspective. And I say this, and I always say on the radio, folks, my opinion is not necessarily the opinions of Radio Al Ansar. There is benefits to cannabis, and yes, there are dangers as well. But in terms of the benefits, if we look at those benefits and we look at those benefits in the light of this massive 100-year prohibition, it has led to all these cultivars and all of these strains that are being bred for the highness of it rather than for the medical attributes of it, which is such a pity, because we've spent 100 years misusing something that could really be part of our apothecary kit like it used to be back in the pre-colonial days. So that's just my little addition to what you're saying, Myrtle. Now, let's talk a little bit about if you're looking at your family members, what do we look for if somebody has developed a substance dependency to cannabis? What are the signs or the symptoms that we know, okay, this is somebody, let's address it, if we haven't addressed it, because as you say, many people don't.
Well, I just first want to say is that I use cannabis every single day, and I run 4 companies. I've recovered from the murder of my partner. I work at the United Nations. I work at the African Union, and I use cannabis all day, every day. And I'm not ashamed at all to say that. And I do not have a cannabis use disorder. So before we jump in and accuse people, if you are making the judgment on this other person that they are using too much cannabis, okay, it usually is with a teenager, or it usually is with somebody who's not getting on very well in their life. I would really guard against now jumping in and sending your young person in your life off to a rehab to go and get off of this, and they must never use cannabis again. I would also guard against this myth that the cannabis strains that we have now are much stronger than they used to be, and that very strong or high THC cannabis is bad for you. Like it's saying that, okay, it's better to drink wine than to drink straw rum or 95% alcohol or whatever. It really is very, very dependent on the individual person. And that is why it makes cannabis is very difficult to understand. And we've had the authorities in our country vilifying cannabis so much, particularly the Department of Social Development. They were picketing outside our case in the Pretoria High Court in 2017, and they bust up people from KZN with substance use disorders to picket outside because of this huge, big stigma. So it's very difficult for me to give advice to somebody who feels like their family member has a cannabis use disorder, because most of the time it's just because they do not understand cannabis and because of the stigma. Now, would you, in the old days, people used to take their kids to the police and make them lock them up to try and get them to stop using cannabis. People would never do that now. So,
without addressing the real issues that are causing. So in other words, what you're saying is what I'm
it really is very rare. It's very rare that people are so-called addicted to cannabis. It's I think that in the context of prohibition and the fact that we are trying to break down the stigma and create more understanding of the plant, we really have to guard against vilifying THC. your cannabinoid receptors do not receive the cannabis medicine without THC. You know, a lot of the medicine that is being prescribed by doctors, those few doctors who know, is not full spectrum medicine. And we have something called the entourage effect, which we've been speaking about, which is we need the whole plant to be able to move forward with this as medicine and to be able to move forward with this as our understanding. So we really do not need to be scared of very strong cannabis. Nobody has ever died from cannabis, ever.
So nobody has ever died from cannabis ever. I think that's I suppose a good way to close that off as we go into our ad break, and we're going to be straight back after this ad break. Please don't go away. We're talking to Myrtle Clark about cannabis, its uses and its history, and soon to come, its future. Stay with us. We'll be back after this.
Join Huda SA as we raise funds to complete phase 2 of the finishes of the Ilovo Masjid construction. We humbly request your generous Sadaqah Ejariya and Lillah donations. Your contribution helps build a masjid and earn everlasting rewards. For more information, contact Huda SA on 031 271 3049 or visit www.huda-int.org. Act now and earn your share of sawab. Donate today. Huda SA, building communities, strengthening faith.
The people of Palestine need your support now. Africa Muslims Agency is on the ground, already providing food, medication, and emergency supplies in Gaza. Donate any amount to Heal Palestine at africamuslimsagency.co.za. Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
The Sunday Lounge with Salma Kazi Wahab. 10 to 12, latest of the Nasheed, celebrity artist features, events, news from the Nasheed world. Top 10 Sunday Lounge with Salma Kazi Wahab.
Radio Al-Ansar, Durban, 90.4 FM, Peter Maritzburg, 105.6 FM.
Welcome back to Green Thumbs Up. We are talking about cannabis today. This show is not about the promotion of anything whatsoever. This show is addressing the very real issues and the very real constraints. And so we're not demonizing and we're not promoting. We're saying it is time that people are educated by it. And I need to say that we've received a message here, Assalamu alaikum, just tuned in. Cannabis that is available from drug lords is laced with other drugs. Well, perhaps consider not getting drugs from drug lords would be my response to that, if I may be so bold as to say so. We're a gardening show, natural living show, and we are talking about cannabis as a plant with its medical properties. And we have said on the show that the fact that it has been a prohibited plant for so long has prevented the adequate research on its medical properties and its use. The fact that it has been used, distorted, let's also consider the fact that, you know, a drug is not something anybody should be out there looking for. We're talking about plant health here. There are many plants that are psychoactive in nature. By the way, there are many plants. There are plants such as Damiana, which is the moonflower, which can lead to some really serious convulsions and even death. And yet it is grown in South Africa as a flower, as a plant. So the idea of this show is to educate and to inform, which is what we're here to do today with Myrtle Clark, who is for today our expert in the topic. So Myrtle, going back to what we were talking about in terms of, you know, looking at if you suspect that somebody is using, have that conversation, speak to the person, because there is nothing, for me as a social worker, I have seen that the worst thing that can happen is when there are issues and they get swept under the carpet. And that can be issues with regards to marriage, with regards to relationships, with regards to substance abuse, with regards to plant use, with regards to oversleeping, overwatching of certain things that people, shouldn't be watching because it distorts our minds and distorts our brains. And so if we look at the future of cannabis, the research that's being done now, where do you think South Africa is headed?
Well, I think that South Africa we can be proud of ourselves that we are the first country in Africa to legalize the adult use of cannabis. And we always call it the responsible adult use of cannabis,
Yes.
because there are millions of South African adults who use cannabis responsibly. And since September 2018, when we got our Constitutional Court verdict, it has been legal for adults to consume and cultivate cannabis in private, so within private spaces. Okay. So there's no consuming cannabis in public, which is absolutely fine. We've all got our private spaces to consume and to cultivate. And I think that would be interesting for your listeners, because we are allowed to grow our own cannabis for our own consumption. And one of the best ways to learn about cannabis is to actually grow it yourself. Even if you can just grow a pot plant, you will learn about this amazing, amazing plant. So that's where we are legally. The trade in cannabis is not legal yet, but the personal consumption and cultivation of cannabis is legal.
And that's where the trade not being legal of it opens itself to the abuse of it and adding it to things or adding things to it that you don't really know what you're getting. So I know in Colorado, for instance, they are very good at growing specific strains where they literally look at, the amount of THC, the amount of CBD, the amounts of CBG and all of these others, and I just want to also mention, if you look at Delta Naught and Delta, I think it's Delta 6, not being, so it has a lower THC level to allow the absorption of the CBD, and even the CBD, the pure CBD plants that one gets. You've got the pure CBD plants always have a remnant of THC because it is required for the processing of the CBD, as you say. It was interesting for me when I was in Portugal recently. I went to go and have a look around, and I went to see, because the laws in Portugal are supposedly the same as here. However, Portugal has legalized all sorts of drugs, everything except marijuana, which is very interesting. And yet, when we go and look at what they're doing with the plant, they are selling a CBD flower, for instance, and that flower has been harvested. It's been sent to a laboratory where chemical processes have stripped away the THC, and then they've added 0.2% of THC because it's necessary for the absorption of the CBD. But they've now added chemicals to it. And again, in trying to meet the legislation, we don't know what the long-term effect is of those chemicals, which is why it's so important to learn about these things. So, Sister Luthia, we have a message here on WhatsApp. Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum salam. It's Luthia from Verulam. Lovely topic on the cannabis plant. Do you get any better scented plants that would have medical purposes to smoke? Because cannabis smells awful. So Luthia, from myself, I can say we did a show with Margaret Roberts, and perhaps what we can do down the line is replay that show for the listeners. And it was all about how to quit smoking through the use of herbs. And I think today we've touched on how to, exit drugs through the use of cannabis. So in terms of smoking, plants, The smoking of plants for medical purposes has existed for centuries, since the beginning of time, from your smoking tents with the, the Red Indians, and in Africa, it is in fact our own Khoi people that have called cannabis dacha. The word comes from them. But things like chamomile is something that my father personally used to use. He switched from smoking a cigarette. We tried to get him off. So he switched to a pipe where he used only herbs. And one of the things that he used was chamomile. Yes, the chamomile that you use as tea. So there are many different things, and perhaps we'll revisit that. But for today, Myrtle, what do we look forward to in terms of the legislation? Do we think that it's going to become completely free, where more research can be done, where people can actually regulate what is being sold? Because the problem is what's being sold now isn't regulated.
Exactly. So we are still sitting in a rather grey area since the Constitutional Court ruling, and the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act was made into law just the day before our election in May. But the regulations that go with the Act have not been promulgated. Now, this issue of quality control, packaging, ingredients, knowing what you get is something that's very, very close to my heart here at our NGO called Fields of Green for All. And people are welcome to visit our website. It's got 47 pages, and we've got a huge resource library. And you were speaking about research. So now cannabis is completely legal for any form of research whatsoever in South Africa. There are a few African countries where it can also be and of course it remains the most researched plant on the planet. So it is legal research. It's legal to consume within prices. It's legal to grow your own, but we are waiting for the regulations that go with the trade, because obviously we need to evolve. We want the selling the matchbox on the corner, we want that person to continue to be able to put bread on the table. So this is a very complicated sociological issue of people's livelihoods, because people have been making a living out of cannabis for a long time. But we also want to be able to regulate the quality of the cannabis. So this is something that we're working very hard on creating.
Okay, I think we've
operating principles going forward and making way for legal trade in South Africa.
Well, Myrtle, I cannot believe that we have run out of time. This has been a fascinating topic, and I want to say thank you so much for making the time to sit with us today. The show has been all about talking about the truths of cannabis, the pros, the cons, the thoughts, the considerations, the sociological issues, the everything really about cannabis. I think that this definitely deserves a deeper insight. We'll wait to hear from our listeners. If you would like to continue with this topic next week, please do go ahead and WhatsApp us so that we can continue it with you. You know that number. That number is 060-904-1056. So thank you, Myrtle, so much for making time for us. That is the end of our show, folks.
Thank you.
Yes. No, what do you think? Let us have your thoughts, and we will catch you same time, same place next week, Sunday from 9 to 10, only on Green Thumbs Up. From my side, remember, today is a beautiful day to be happy. So until next week, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you once again, Myrtle.
Thank you.
Radio Al-Ansar, Durban, 90.4 FM. Pietermaritzburg, 105.6 FM.
An informative Islamic global perspective. This is Al-Ansar News.
And traffic authorities have set up a satellite base in Van Wienen's Pass on the N3 in anticipation of more snowfall. Good morning, I'm Tabile Duma, Transport and Traffic Authority.